I had always been skeptical of ghost stories, dismissing tales of the supernatural as overblown campfire yarns. But that all changed one rainy night on a train bound for Boston. The year was 1982, and I was traveling back from visiting my mother in Maine. It was one of those heavy, cold autumn rains that pounded relentlessly against the windows, shrouding the landscape in dark shadows and mist. The train was nearly empty that evening, save for a few other weary travelers scattered throughout the cars. Settling into my seat, I pulled out a book and tried to lose myself in its pages, but my focus kept slipping, drawn back to the strange feeling that clung to the air. The train rattled over the rails, each metallic click reverberating like a whispered warning. The lights flickered occasionally, and the longer I sat, the more I felt an odd unease creeping over me. Just as I started to convince myself I was imagining things, a figure in a vintage conductor's uniform appeared at the far end of the car, moving slowly in my direction. The man was tall, his uniform pristine and neat, though it looked like it belonged to another era. There was something unsettling about the way he moved, almost as if he were gliding rather than walking. He seemed disconnected from the present, a shadow from another time. When he drew closer, I noticed his expression, or rather the lack of it. His face was blank, pale, with hollowed eyes that seemed almost empty. He stopped by each seat, pausing as if expecting passengers to present their tickets, though he didn't reach for them. Instead, he nodded once to each invisible transaction before moving to the next passenger. I clutched my own ticket instinctively as he neared, heart pounding in my chest. When he reached me, I couldn't resist speaking, though my voice wavered. "Sir, are you the conductor?" He turned his head slowly, his gaze meeting mine, or at least it felt like it did, even though his eyes were just dark, empty sockets. His mouth opened and a hollow, distant voice filled the air. "Have you seen the last passenger?" His words chilled me to the bone, their emptiness ringing in my ears. I couldn't respond, could only stare as he waited a beat longer, then moved on, continuing his spectral routine. As he disappeared into the next car, I exhaled, not realizing until that moment that I had been holding my breath. I tried to shake it off, rationalizing that it had to be some strange prank, or maybe just a very convincing actor playing a part to scare passengers. But I could still feel the chill in the air, lingering long after he had vanished from sight. The woman seated across the aisle leaned over, her face pale. Did you see him too?" she whispered. Her voice barely audible. I nodded, still shaken. Who was that?" Her voice trembled as she spoke, her eyes darting around the empty car. They say that was Conductor Whitaker. He vanished on his last shift in 1975, just disappeared without a trace. The only thing they ever found was his hat, left on an empty seat at the end of the line. I remembered hearing about him, a local legend in New England. Conductor Whitaker had been beloved by passengers and staff alike, known for his cheerful demeanor and dedication. Then one stormy night, much like this one, he simply vanished. No body, no note, only that hat. Some say he lost his way on that night, searching for a passenger that never appeared, bound to wander the train in search of them forever. I tried to dismiss it, chalk it up to urban legend, but the image of those hollow eyes haunted me. I tried to return to my book, but every sound of the train seemed amplified, each flicker of the lights a reminder of the eerie figure I had seen. I wasn't the only one affected. The other passengers looked equally disturbed, some casting anxious glances down the aisle, as if fearing his return. When the train came to a halt at my station, I grabbed my bag and hurried toward the exit. Just as I reached the door, I couldn't resist one last glance down the aisle. And there he was, standing at the far end of the car, staring directly at me, his empty eyes boring into my soul. My skin prickled as I stepped onto the platform, the rain pouring down as I made my way through the station and out into the parking lot. Days passed, and I tried to push the experience from my mind, but the image of that conductor haunted me. At night, I'd see him in my dreams, his hollow gaze always fixed on me, asking that same question. "Have you seen the last passenger?" I began researching, obsessively combing through old newspapers and online forums, hoping to find some explanation, some evidence that I wasn't losing my mind. And then I found it. A photo, recently shared on an obscure ghost hunting website, taken by a passenger who had claimed to see the same conductor. The image was grainy, taken through a phone camera, but there was no mistaking him. There he stood, in the same old uniform, his face turned toward the camera. But in the photo, his empty eye socket seemed to stare straight through the screen, right at me. My heart raced as I examined it, noticing something in the background that sent chills down my spine. It was my reflection, faint and blurred, as if I had been standing directly behind the photographer. But I hadn't been there when the photo was taken. I hadn't even been on the train that night. The realization dawned on me with horrifying clarity. Somehow, I was becoming part of his world, slipping between the realms of the living and the dead. That night, I dreamed again. Only this time, I wasn't a passenger. I was wearing the conductor's uniform, walking through the empty train cars, searching. A burning need consumed me, an endless quest for the last passenger. Each car I entered felt heavier, colder, like something was tugging at my soul, pulling me into an abyss I couldn't escape. I jolted awake, drenched in sweat, only to find myself gripping a worn conductor's cap in my hands. I had never seen it before, but it felt familiar, as if it belonged to me. Frantic, I tossed it across the room, my heart pounding. The days blurred after that. I stopped taking trains, avoided the station entirely, but the dreams persisted. I'd wander the empty cars, searching, always searching. Each time I awoke, the conductor's cap would be somewhere nearby, closer than the night before. One stormy evening, I couldn't resist any longer. I returned to the station and boarded the last train of the night, feeling a strange sense of calm. The train was empty save for me, and as it pulled away from the platform, I felt a presence behind me. Turning slowly, I found myself face to face with the conductor, his hollow eyes filled with a sorrow I finally understood. "Have you seen the last passenger?" he asked one final time, and this time, I understood my answer. In that moment, I knew I would never leave this train again. The conductor nodded, a faint glimmer of relief flickering in his empty gaze, and as I took my place by his side, the last passenger at last, I realized the train was no longer moving. It hadn't been for a very long time. I'm not usually one for ghost stories or legends, but when I heard about the old bridge outside of Millbrook, curiosity got the better of me. A nearly forgotten railway bridge, they said, stood deep in the countryside, spanning a murky, winding river. The track hadn't seen a train in decades, but locals swore they still heard it. The haunting whistle of a train bound for nowhere, echoing through the mist on foggy nights. It was an old story around here, whispered in half-joking tones over pints at the pub. They called it the Bridge of Lost Souls, saying that a train had crashed there during a flood back in the 1920s, toppling off the bridge and plunging its passengers into the black waters below. Trapped in the wreckage, the story went. Most of them drowned, their bodies never recovered, and their spirits doomed to haunt the bridge. I didn't believe a word of it. Stories like that seemed custom-made to scare thrill-seekers like me, but something about the tale lingered. Maybe it was the description of skeletal hands clawing up from the water or the whispered cries for help that supposedly drifted up from below. It was so macabre, so specific. I found myself compelled to go out there just once, to prove to myself that there was nothing to it. One chilly autumn night, thick with fog, I drove out to the bridge with a flashlight and nothing but my nerves to keep me company. The air was cold, heavy with the damp scent of fallen leaves and moss-covered stone. I parked my car at the end of the road and walked the final stretch through the overgrown path, my footsteps barely audible over the thick silence. When I reached the bridge, the fog had settled low, pooling around the abandoned tracks like a ghostly sea. The old, rusted rails stretched across the river, sagging and warped with time. I felt the chill crawl up my spine as I stepped onto the wooden slats, each one creaking beneath my weight. The river below was barely visible, a murky void that seemed to swallow what little light my flashlight offered. I walked a few paces, stopping in the middle of the bridge. A low, unnatural silence filled the air, broken only by the faint sound of the river flowing below. I laughed to myself, half in relief, and was about to turn back when a distant sound stopped me cold. It was a faint whistle, high and mournful, echoing through the mist. My stomach dropped. I turned slowly, shining my flashlight down the length of the bridge, but there was nothing. No lights, no sign of anything at all. Just the empty, decaying tracks stretching into the fog. I told myself it was the wind, or maybe the echo of some distant train miles away, but my hands shook as I clutched the flashlight. Then I heard it, a whisper. "Help. Please, help us." The voice was barely audible, but unmistakably there, drifting up from below. My heart pounded as I shone the light down over the edge of the bridge, straining to see through the fog. And then I saw them. Pale, skeletal hands reaching up from the river, their bony fingers clutching at the air as if grasping for something just out of reach. They moved slowly, methodically, like they were waiting, watching. I took a step back, my heart racing as the voices grew louder, a cacophony of desperate pleas rising from the water below. "Please, let us out. Don't leave us here." I stumbled, nearly dropping the flashlight, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The hands clawed against the empty air, pulling at the fog, their fingers scraping against each other with a sound that sent chills through my bones. Then, through the mist, I saw movement, a shadow, vague and shifting, but unmistakably the outline of a train car, half submerged in the river below. The twisted metal, broken glass, and scattered debris were faint but visible, as though the wreckage itself were reaching out to me, begging for release. I turned to run, but froze at the sight of a man standing at the other end of the bridge, barely visible through the fog. He was dressed in an old conductor's uniform, soaked through with water, his skin pale and waxy, like he had been dragged from the depths of the river. His face was a hollow mask, eyes black pits that seemed to bore into my soul. He lifted his hand and gestured for me to come forward, his mouth moving soundlessly. I didn't dare approach, but it felt like my feet were rooted to the bridge, unable to turn away from his gaze. Then he spoke, his voice a low rasp that echoed through the fog. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his words heavy with sorrow. "The river doesn't let go of its own." I tried to respond, to say anything, but my voice caught in my throat. He looked down at the skeletal hands clawing up from the water, a flicker of pain crossing his ghostly face. "They're still waiting," he murmured. "All of them. Waiting for someone to bring them home." With that, he vanished, dissipating into the fog like smoke. I stumbled back, finally finding my feet, and ran down the bridge as fast as I could, my heart pounding with each step. But as I reached the end, I froze, the unmistakable sound of creaking wood echoing behind me. I turned slowly, and my heart stopped. The bridge was empty, but the skeletal hands had risen higher, clawing their way up the old timbers, their fingers scraping against the wood in slow, methodical movements. They were trying to reach the tracks, desperate to escape the river's grip. And then, just when I thought I couldn't bear it any longer, the whistle echoed through the fog again, louder this time, closer. In a flash, I saw the train, not as a shadow, but as it must have been before the crash. It was barreling toward the bridge, lights blazing, wheels grinding against the metal tracks. But it wasn't stopping, it was heading straight for me. I scrambled off the bridge, barely making it to the edge before the train hurtled past, its whistle a piercing scream. I turned, watching in horror as the spectral train raced across the bridge, vanishing just before it would have plunged into the river. As it disappeared, the hands released the bridge, sinking back into the water with one last mournful wail. The fog settled again, swallowing the bridge in silence. I didn't remember how I got back to my car, only that I drove as fast as I could, my hands trembling on the wheel. But I knew I wasn't the same. Every night since, I've heard that whistle echoing in my dreams, seen those skeletal hands reaching for me, pulling me back to the bridge. I've tried to forget, to move on, but I know now that the river doesn't let go of its own. And one day, whether in this life or the next, I fear that whistle will come for me, calling me back to the bridge of lost souls. I never used to be superstitious. Ghost stories were for kids, the kind of thing you left behind when you grew up. But after that night on Car 13, I'm not so sure anymore. It started innocuously enough. I was traveling late one evening, returning home after a long week at work. I had missed the earlier train, and with the next one delayed, I was stuck wandering the platform, trying to keep warm under the flickering station lights. Finally, the last train of the night arrived, and I climbed aboard, tired and ready for sleep. The train was empty, which was a relief. I found a seat halfway down and settled in, leaning my head against the window, letting the gentle rocking of the car lull me into a drowsy haze. Outside, the world blurred past in streaks of streetlights and shadows. But then, something strange caught my attention. I glanced up at the small placard above my seat, the one indicating the car number. 13. I chuckled to myself, vaguely remembering the legend that the train company had once decommissioned Car 13. I thought it was odd, considering here I was, sitting in it. Most companies avoid that number entirely, but I didn't think much of it. After all, superstition's never really been my thing. As the train picked up speed, I found myself sinking deeper into my seat, almost hypnotized by the rhythmic clatter of the tracks. I was drifting off when the temperature in the car dropped so suddenly that I shivered. It was early autumn, and the air outside was crisp but hardly cold enough to freeze my breath. Yet here I was, rubbing my hands together, trying to shake off the chill. I glanced around, suddenly feeling uneasy, though I couldn't place why. The car was completely empty. Or, at least, I thought it was. The silence pressed down on me, the sounds of the train seemed to dampen, and that's when I noticed something strange in the window. The reflection. It looked wrong. Squinting, I stared into the glass. My reflection was there, tired and blurry-eyed, but behind me, faintly visible in the dim light, was the hazy outline of a person. They sat 2 rows back, their head turned slightly toward me. I jerked around, my heart racing, but the seat behind me was empty. My pulse pounded, but I forced myself to relax, brushing it off as a trick of the light. But when I glanced back at the window, I froze. The figure was still there. And worse, there were others now. More shadowy shapes filling the seats around me, vague outlines that seemed to emerge from the darkness, their faces blank and featureless, as if they had no eyes. Just deep, hollow voids where their gazes should have been. My mouth went dry, and I squeezed my eyes shut, telling myself I was overtired. But the whispers started then, faint murmurs I could barely make out over the hum of the train. "Don't leave, don't forget." I opened my eyes, my heart pounding louder than the wheels on the tracks, and slowly turned to look over my shoulder. The seats were empty. I exhaled, telling myself it was my mind playing tricks. But when I looked back into the reflection, I nearly screamed. They were all there, filling the rows around me, their shadowy faces trained on me, as though they had been waiting. Their expressions were vague, hollow, but somehow expectant. My hands trembled as I glanced down at the empty seats around me, wondering if I was losing my mind. Then I felt it, a sudden, icy pressure on my shoulder, as if a hand was pressing down, heavy and cold, burning through my coat. I jerked forward, spinning around wildly, but the seat behind me was empty. "Don't leave us." The whisper came again, louder this time, and I felt something brush against my hair, soft as a whisper, but sharp enough to send chills down my spine. A flickering light caught my attention, and I turned back to the window. In the reflection, the shadowy figures had moved closer, surrounding me now, their faces somehow clearer. I could make out their hollow, empty eyes, fixed on me, unblinking. In a panic, I stumbled out of my seat, pressing the call conductor button repeatedly. The intercom crackled, but no one answered. I moved down the aisle, trying to reach the door to the next car, desperate to leave the cursed Car 13 behind. But as I walked, the seats began to fill with the shadowy figures, row by row. They were everywhere now, their vacant stares following me, growing more intense, more desperate. One of them was whispering, her voice raspy, barely audible. She leaned forward, her bony fingers clutching the edge of her seat, her face coming into view. Pale, gaunt, her eyes deep sunken hollows that seemed to absorb every flicker of light. "Help us, please. Don't let us be forgotten." I stumbled back, nearly falling over as the door to the next car loomed ahead. Grabbing for the handle, I pulled it open and darted through, slamming it shut behind me. The door clicked and I held it closed, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. Taking a moment to catch my breath, I turned to check the new car. But when I looked up, I felt all the air leave my lungs. It was the same car, the same number above the seats, 13. The same arrangement, the same worn, faded seats, and the same empty, hollow-eyed figures, now seated throughout, their expressions filled with a mix of sorrow and longing. They watched me as if they knew me, as if they'd been waiting for me to join them. "No, this isn't real," I muttered, backing away, my gaze darting to the window in desperate hope for some sign of reality. But all I saw was my own horrified reflection, and behind me, row after row of those shadowy, ghostly passengers waiting in silence. Desperate, I tried the door again, but this time it was locked, unyielding. I slammed my fists against it, my breathing ragged, panic clawing at my throat. "Don't leave us." The whispers filled the car now, overlapping voices, pleading, insistent. "Don't let us disappear." In the reflection, one of the figures leaned closer, her face clearer now, and I recognized her. A woman whose face I'd seen in a newspaper clipping once, part of a tragic headline from years ago. She had died on car 13, one of the souls lost when the train derailed. She was young, her dark eyes empty, her mouth slightly open, as if frozen mid-scream. Her hand reached for my shoulder in the reflection, and as I turned, her ghostly fingers brushed against my neck, cold and wet. I pulled back, pressing myself against the window, feeling trapped as the figures crowded around me, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and old iron. "Let us go," they whispered, voices filling my ears. "Free us." My mind was spinning, but then, just as suddenly as they'd appeared, the figures began to dissolve into the shadows, fading like mist as the train slowed, screeching to a stop. The door behind me clicked open. I didn't wait. I bolted out, barely noticing the station around me as I staggered into the cold night air, gasping, feeling their eyes on me even as the platform emptied. When I glanced back at the train, car 13 wasn't there. In its place was an empty gap, as though it had never existed at all. They say car 13 was removed from service after it derailed, that it was scrapped, gone forever. But now I know better. Car 13 was never truly gone. It was waiting, filled with the lost souls of those passengers who died on that fateful night. And now, every time I take a train, I feel them there in the shadows, waiting for me, waiting for anyone who dares to board. Because they can't leave until someone remembers them, until someone joins them to take their place. And if you ever find yourself alone in a train car, feeling a sudden chill and noticing an empty seat behind you, check the number of your car. Because car 13 still rides the tracks and the passengers inside, well, they're still waiting for someone to bring them home.